The air in the small room felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken things between Eleanor and her mother, Margaret. Sitting in the worn armchair, Eleanor watched her mother dozing on the sofa, a book resting on her chest, rising and falling with each quiet breath. It was an ordinary scene, yet Eleanor found herself etching it into her memory, like a precious photograph she might need to revisit. At 40, Eleanor had built a comfortable, predictable life, a small but tidy apartment, a fulfilling job as a book conservator at a museum, a close circle of friends who filled the space where a long-term relationship might have been. Her life was orderly, planned, everything in its place, except for these visits to her mother's house, which always stirred up a complicated mix of duty, guilt, and a deep, persistent ache. Margaret hadn't been an easy mother. She had raised Eleanor alone after her husband, Eleanor's father, left them when Eleanor was just a little girl. Life had been a constant struggle. Margaret worked multiple jobs, her hands often rough and tired, and by the time she got home, there was little energy left for the gentle affection Eleanor craved. The loneliness of being a single mother, however, was a burden Margaret sometimes sought to lighten in ways that left Eleanor feeling neglected. There had been a brief, tumultuous period when a man had entered Margaret's life, consuming her attention, her heart, leaving young Eleanor feeling abandoned and resentful. As the years passed, a quiet bitterness had taken root in Eleanor. She held on to every perceived slight, every broken promise, every time she felt her mother had chosen someone or something else over her. Even as Margaret, years later, tried to bridge the distance, the hurt lingered, a wall built brick by silent brick. Yet beneath the layers of resentment, love remained, a buried ember waiting for air. It was simply lost, stifled by poor choices and the suffocating weight of unspoken words. "Leaving already?" Margaret's voice, still thick with sleep, startled Eleanor, who was gathering her bag. "Yes, I have some work to finish," Eleanor replied, keeping her tone neutral, carefully avoiding any hint of the emotions churning beneath the surface. "Always work, isn't it?" Margaret commented, not accusingly, but with a note of quiet sadness that Eleanor chose to ignore. This was their rhythm, had been for years. Conversations skirting the edges of their lives, polite inquiries about work or health, never venturing into the deeper waters of their feelings, the pain that lay beneath the surface. A formal dance between two women bound by blood, yet separated by years of silence and misunderstanding. Then one afternoon, just like any other, the phone call came. "It's your mother," the voice on the other end, a neighbor Eleanor barely knew, said calmly. "She's been taken to the hospital. A bad fall." The next few days were a blur of sterile corridors, hushed voices, and frightening medical terms. A stroke. Severe. The prognosis uncertain. Eleanor navigated the crisis with the same efficiency she applied to her work projects. She organized medical reports, managed appointments, researched symptoms. It was easier this way, dealing with the practicalities of the illness, than confronting the raw fear and vulnerability that lay beneath. She could be the capable daughter, the one who handled things without having to wade into the complicated emotional history between them. Months passed. Margaret's recovery was slow, arduous. The stroke had left lasting damage. Mobility was limited, speech still difficult, but she was alive, stable, gradually regaining some independence. Eleanor visited regularly, maintaining her competent distance, discussing medications, therapy sessions, the weather. The wall of silence remained, a silent third presence in the room. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the stroke, Eleanor arrived at her mother's house with groceries and a new prescription. She found Margaret sitting on the back porch, gazing out at the small garden she could no longer tend. The late afternoon sun cast a gentle light on her face, highlighting the lines etched by age and illness. "I brought the groceries," Eleanor said, setting the bags down on the porch table. Margaret simply nodded, her eyes fixed on a wilting rosebush. Then with slow, deliberate movements, she reached up and unclasped the simple silver necklace she always wore, a delicate chain with a small oval pendant. "I want you to have this," she said, her voice a little stronger than usual, holding the necklace out in her palm. Eleanor took it, bewildered. She had never paid much attention to the necklace. It was pretty, she supposed, but plain. No jewels, no elaborate design. The oval pendant had a faint, intricate pattern on it, like tiny waves or perhaps swirling stars. It was hard to tell. Why? The question hovered on her lips, but she couldn't voice it. A part of her was afraid of the answer, afraid that this was a final gesture, a goodbye. Thank you, was all she managed, slipping the cool metal into her pocket. The silent exchange hung between them, a heavy weight in the air, an unspoken conversation neither had the courage to begin. The necklace remained in Eleanor's jewelry box for months, tucked away with other forgotten things. An old birthday card, a faded photograph from a long-ago family trip to the coast, relics of a time when connection hadn't felt so difficult, before resentment and silence had built their formidable barrier. Then one damp spring morning, Eleanor woke feeling unwell. Nothing serious, just a persistent fatigue and a dull ache she'd been ignoring. She decided to make an appointment for a checkup at a large medical clinic downtown, a sprawling building with multiple departments. Before she left, on an impulse she couldn't explain, she opened her jewelry box and picked up her mother's necklace. She held the pendant for a moment, running her finger over its textured surface. It felt cool and smooth against her skin. Then she fastened the clasp around her neck, the familiar weight settling just below her collarbone. The clinic waiting room was busy, filled with the hushed murmur of voices and the rustle of magazines. Eleanor checked in, gave her name, and sat down, idly flipping through a worn copy of a gardening magazine. She didn't immediately notice the nurse, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense bun of gray-streaked hair, watching her from the reception desk. "Eleanor Vance," the receptionist called out. Eleanor stood, gathering her things, and started walking towards the hallway that led to the examination rooms. As she passed the reception area, she felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was the nurse. "Excuse me," the nurse said, her voice soft, but with an undertone of something that made Eleanor pause. Her name tag read Sarah. "That necklace," Sarah continued, her gaze fixed on the silver pendant visible at Eleanor's throat. "It belonged to Margaret, didn't it? Margaret Vance?" Eleanor froze, surprised. The necklace was mostly hidden beneath her sweater. How had she noticed? "Yes," Eleanor replied, a little flustered. "Yes, it was my mother's. She gave it to me." Sarah's face softened, her eyes suddenly filling with tears. There was something familiar about her face, her expression, but Eleanor couldn't place her. "How is she?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly, the professional demeanor of the clinic dissolving for a moment. Is she doing okay?" "Yes," Eleanor said, feeling a strange wave of emotion herself, a vulnerability she wasn't used to. "Yes, she's doing much better. A long road, but she's recovering." Sarah let out a shaky breath, a look of profound relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank goodness. I feared the worst. She was so brave, so determined." Eleanor blinked, confused. You were her nurse?" "Yes," Sarah nodded, a gentle smile touching her lips. "I was with her, during her stay at the hospital, when she first came in." Sarah hesitated as if choosing her words carefully. "She talked about you, you know, often, about how proud she was of you, of the woman you'd become, despite everything." Eleanor swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. Proud? Margaret had never said that. Not directly. Not in a way Eleanor had been able to hear. I didn't know," Eleanor managed, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah's smile was understanding. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it's hard to say those things, isn't it? Especially when the words have been stuck for a long time." She looked at the necklace again. Do you know the story behind this necklace?" Eleanor shook her head, a newfound curiosity stirring within her. Margaret had simply given it to her, without explanation. "Margaret told me," Sarah said, her voice gentle, like she was sharing a precious secret. "It belonged to your grandmother, her mother. Your grandfather gave it to her when they were courting, before the war. Margaret said the pattern on the pendant is meant to represent the date they met, a code between them. When your grandfather came back from the war, they married, and years later when he passed away, your grandmother gave the necklace to Margaret. Margaret said, she told me she wanted you to have it, to remember where you came from, who you came from, something to connect you, even when words felt impossible. The receptionist called Eleanor's name again, more insistently this time. But Eleanor barely heard. She was lost in the layers of meaning woven into the simple silver pendant, in the quiet love story it represented, in the unspoken message her mother had tried to convey. Sarah leaned in slightly, her expression serious, a profound sincerity in her kind eyes. "Can I give you some advice?" she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Forget this appointment. Go. Go to your mother and hug her. Tell her, tell her everything you're feeling. I lost my mother a long time ago, and I miss her every single day. Don't waste the time you have." Eleanor's appointment was just minutes away, but in that moment, the reason for her visit to the clinic felt trivial, insignificant. She nodded, a silent promise passing between her and this kind stranger. Sarah gave her hand a gentle squeeze before turning to call the next patient. Driving home, Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of memories. She saw Margaret younger, tirelessly working, her hands chapped but strong. She remembered sick days, her mother sitting on the edge of her bed, reading stories even when exhausted, sewing her a dress for a school play because they couldn't afford to buy one, always leaving her the last piece of cake, even when Eleanor knew she wanted it herself. Small acts of love, often overlooked, dismissed as obligations, or simply not seen through the haze of her own youthful self-absorption and accumulated grievances. The necklace felt heavier around her neck now, not just metal, but a tangible link to generations of women, a silent chain of love that had endured through hardship, loss, and the painful silence that had grown between mother and daughter. It was a legacy, passed down through struggle and sacrifice. She turned the car instinctively towards her mother's house, not her own apartment. It was early evening when she parked on the quiet street. A warm light spilled from the living room window. She could see Margaret, sitting in her favorite chair, working on a crossword puzzle, a lifelong habit. Eleanor walked up the path, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and something akin to childish anticipation. She hadn't called ahead. She rang the doorbell, feeling a flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Eleanor?" Margaret's voice held a note of surprise as she opened the door. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" "Yes." Eleanor hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "No, I just... Can I come in?" They sat in the kitchen, the familiar scent of tea brewing filling the air. It was a comforting ritual, steeped in years of repetition. Eleanor watched her mother, moving with a little more ease now, her white hair neatly styled, her hands still nimble despite the arthritis that sometimes troubled them. "I met someone today," Eleanor began, her voice a little unsteady as Margaret placed the steaming mugs on the table. "At the clinic. A nurse. Sarah." Margaret paused, the teapot in her hand. "Sarah?" she repeated, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Oh yes, the kind one. At the hospital." "You remember her?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Of course I remember her," Margaret said, sitting down. "She was very good to me." Eleanor touched the pendant of the necklace. Margaret's gaze followed her hand. "She told me about this," Eleanor said softly. "The necklace. Its story." A silence fell between them, but this time it wasn't the old, tense silence of unspoken resentments. It was a quiet, expectant space, filled with the promise of understanding. "It was your grandmother's," Margaret finally said, her voice low. "She gave it to me after your father left. She said it was a reminder that love endures, even when it feels like everything is falling apart." Eleanor felt her eyes sting with tears. So many stories she had never heard. So many pieces of her mother's life she knew nothing about. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Margaret shrugged, a gesture that held both resignation and a hint of regret. "You were always so independent, Eleanor, even as a little girl. I thought, I didn't think you'd be interested in these old stories. And then it just got harder to talk about the important things." "I know," Eleanor admitted, the weight of years of missed opportunities pressing down on her. "I'm sorry." Margaret looked up, surprised. "You have nothing to be sorry for. It was me. I didn't know how." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice stronger. Both of us. Neither of us knew how. Another silence, lighter this time. The tea cooled in their mugs. When you gave me the necklace, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly, I thought it was... She couldn't finish the sentence. A goodbye. Margaret's smile was sad. In a way, it was. The doctors, they didn't give me much hope then. I wanted you to have something of mine, something that was ours. Eleanor reached across the table and took her mother's hand. It was small, the veins prominent, age spots marking the skin, but it was still a hand that had worked tirelessly, that had smoothed her brow when she was feverish, that had held hers through moments of fear and uncertainty. You know what Sarah told me today? Eleanor asked, her voice thick with tears. She said you told her that you just wanted one more Christmas with me. Margaret looked down, as if embarrassed by such a simple, profound desire. I wanted so many more than one, she confessed, her voice barely audible. But back then, even one seemed like an impossible miracle. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face now, freely, unbidden. Without thinking, she got up and went to her mother. She knelt beside her chair, just as she had done as a child, and wrapped her arms around her, holding her tight. No guilt, no hurry, just a simple, desperate embrace. They held each other for a long time, the clock on the wall ticking away the minutes, the precious time they still had together. We don't have to wait for Christmas, Eleanor whispered into her mother's shoulder. We can start now, right now. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret was smiling, her eyes wet too. You know what your grandmother always used to say? She said, her voice soft. Love is like the stars. Even when you can't see it, it's still there. I think she was right, Eleanor said, holding her mother's hand again. That night they didn't unpack all the years of hurt and misunderstanding. They didn't revisit every past slight. There would be time for that if they chose. Instead, they sat together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the autumn sky, while Eleanor listened, for the first time, to the family stories her mother had carried like hidden treasures. Because the love between a mother and a daughter, even when it's been fractured and buried, never truly dies. Sometimes all it takes is one gesture, one simple, heartfelt moment, to remind us that there is still time and that a silent love deserves a voice too.